So this is the original Microsoft Surface, as we call it now, the RT, because it ran Windows RT. I think when this came out, it was just called the Microsoft Surface. That's not the stock wallpaper that it came with. But yeah, this was an interesting device when it came out because Microsoft had this original strategy in 2012, way back, of competing with the iPad. How did they do that? Well, this had an ARM processor somewhere in here made by NVIDIA, an NVIDIA Tegra, and it was a pretty ambitious strategy. It was an interesting approach, you know, from Microsoft, people who made Windows, to make hardware. The idea, though, was that this would be an iPad, but more capable because it kind of could run full Windows. And this was actually Microsoft competing against Dell and HP and a lot of their own hardware makers. So it was an interesting move for them to make. That said, if we look at this 7 years later, well, this thing's a little dated. It's interesting having the camera on the back and the front for a computer because it's basically a tablet. It was one of the earliest convertibles. It was in the Windows 8 era, which we now don't think of very fondly, but back then, this was what Microsoft was doing. And this is what Microsoft is doing now. This is the Microsoft Surface Book 2. And currently, this is still basically the highest end Surface Microsoft makes. So this evolved from this 7 years later. What are the big changes? Well, as you can see, this is the 15-inch model, so they've gotten more confident making bigger hardware, but also this is a real computer. It runs an Intel processor, it runs Windows, even has USB-C, which is pretty modern. And funnily enough, this is actually the only current Surface they sell with USB-C, so I don't know what Microsoft's deal is with that, but that's Microsoft for you. And the interesting thing about this is, well, it is much more like a laptop than the original Surface or even the Surface Pros that they still sell. And that is because, well, it is a laptop. It has a keyboard, pretty beefy base with a pretty beefy dedicated graphics card, specifically a GTX 1060, which is almost like a gaming grade graphics card in a pretty thin form factor. And the reason they're able to do that is because there's the graphics card in here, and there's the CPU and most of the computer in here. And that kind of gets us to this computer's party trick. And you've probably heard of this if you've seen a Surface Book. So you'll notice, look at the Surface Book. It's kind of curved, right? Well, there's a reason for that. It doesn't actually fully fold. When I do log in, this is the Windows desktop experience. I have a trackpad, I have a keyboard, and by the way, that keyboard is pretty great. But if I press this little key here, the whole thing eventually, when it feels like it, will detach. And now I kind of have something a little more like the original Surface RT, which is interesting, but unlike the Surface RT, I don't have a kickstand. The current Surface Pros also have one. So this is kind of weird, this mode. It's basically like an iPad now. But that's what the Surface Book is. It is a laptop that's very good that can turn into an okay tablet. And like I said, unlike the MacBook Pro, this actually is a really good laptop. The MacBook Pro used to be like the gold standard of laptops, but as you might have heard recently, the keyboard isn't so great. This thing has a great keyboard. The trackpad is nowhere near as good as a Mac, but it's about as good as you can get on Windows. The screen's pretty bright, it's good. It is pretty reflective, as you can see, this is outside, and the screen is still showing a lot. Also, the reason I had to type in my passcode is because Windows Hello, the fancy kind of facial ID system to log in, which is really nice, don't work so well outside. So it's not quite as nice as Face ID on iPhones or iPad. But what about what this runs? Windows. And this is real Windows 10, right? Remember how I said that this is the Surface RT, and that's because it ran Windows RT. And Windows RT was Windows designed to run on a mobile ARM processor, meaning it wouldn't run full stuff. This is full Windows, it runs everything. And that's a big advantage. You know, if you look in the YouTube comments, people saying, oh, you know, don't use an iPad, use a Surface, you can run real stuff on it. That's the reason why. And this is full Windows. The strategies have shifted a little bit because if you look at what Apple is doing with the iPad, Apple is making iPad OS, which used to be, you know, basically like Windows RT, really constrained, more and more capable. They're adding things like desktop browsing, downloads, an actual file system, which is interesting. Whereas Microsoft is kind of dealing with what they already have and what everyone already knows, which is Windows. Like I said, that still makes the Surface Book 2 a better laptop, but as a tablet, I still think that the iPad is kind of approaching things from a better direction. And we can see this in some cases of the software. So some software, like OneNote, which is the note-taking software, it's really powerful, it's really great, and it works great in tablet mode. And there's some great universal Windows platform apps, UWP you might have heard of. There's just not a lot of them. It's not like iOS, because the reality is when you install an app on Windows, most of the time it is a 32-bit app like people have been using for decades, not this new fancy Windows thing. And Microsoft hasn't done a great job of making developers make, well, universal Windows apps. All these apps are pretty rare. There are some great ones. There's a YouTube client, there's Reddit clients, there are some really good ones. But if you want high-quality third-party apps, well, unfortunately, macOS is still where you have to go. Yes, you'll get the Adobe suite on here, you'll get what you need to get work done, but a lot of nice things, a lot of really, gorgeous high-end Mac apps, and also exclusive kind of workstation Mac apps like Final Cut, those are only on Mac. And iOS also has some exclusive apps, but the advantage again of Windows is that all the apps here are fully capable out of the box because they are the classic desktop versions. So that brings us to the next point. What is the promise of this device? Like, why does this exist? This is as expensive as a MacBook. In some ways, it's a way better laptop. By the way, it has an SD card slot, which is really cool. Great if you're a photographer or a videographer. But what about that promise? Well, the promise is that this is your one device. This can be a laptop whenever you need that as a workstation on your desk. You take it with you, and then when you need to be even more portable, when you want to watch video, you just detach the screen. And I would do that, but again, it's a little bit of a slow process, so I won't do that now. And you have the Surface Pen for note-taking or if you want to draw. So the promise of the Surface Book 2 is basically to be a convertible that is both portable and professional. Now, it is somewhat professional and it is somewhat portable, but it doesn't do a great job of being the most it can in either of those things. So first of all, that's the unique design that kind of makes that necessary. In order to have the screen detach, they need a weird hinge, and as a result, the hinge, it don't fold fully closed. You might have noticed. People made fun of this a lot when the first Surface Book came out. This is the Surface Book 2, the second crack at it. And while they've done a great job of making the hinge reliable and much better than the original Surface Book, it's still weird. Like, look at that. You can get so much dust and stuff in there. I don't know, it's not ideal, and especially if you're putting this in more slim backpacks or cases, well, it's just not gonna fit because it's so much, it's thick. The two C's on one side, and it's relatively thin on the other, but it's a weird kind of design. It's complicated, right? When you split up a computer, sure, you can have a really beefy graphics card here, somewhat beefy CPU here, but sometimes there's bugs with it. For example, the latest version of Windows I just installed on here, the Windows 10 May update, well, it breaks the dedicated graphics card. Now, the great thing about Windows is I can roll that back, but still, for Microsoft's flagship device, the equivalent of their Google Pixel, their MacBook, their iPhone, to have such a big bug and a major release of Windows, that's not great at all. But there are some other advantages of this design. So because it's split in two parts, that actually means that you get a lot of battery life because both of these things have a battery in them. Now, when you detach the tablet part of it, just the screen, you're gonna get like an hour or two of battery life. But if you have the base on and you're just doing normal laptop things, this actually gets a realistic 8 to 10 hours of real world battery use. Microsoft says 17 hours, but I don't know what they're doing to get that. But it still is a lot of battery, and it's actually better than the current generation of MacBook Pros. Part of that is just because, well, the CPU on this, which I want to talk about. So while the graphics card is a 1060, it's pretty beefy. The CPU, let's talk about that. It's a quad-core CPU, which is fine. A few years ago, that was the highest end you could get on a laptop. But it's a 15-watt chip, meaning it has 15 watts of thermal design power. The MacBooks, the Dell XPS's, high-end Windows laptops use 45 watts, which, if you do some math, that's about 3 times 15. And sure, this thing, it is a quad core like the MacBooks used to be. Nowadays, MacBooks and Dell XPSs are 6 and even 8 cores. Even then, it can't keep up with the clock speeds that the old quad cores could, because meaning it just has to be slower. You have to make some compromises. It's still using Intel's 14 nanometer plus. So it's not very fast. I understand why there's a lot of Windows Surface fanatics, kind of like the way there used to be Apple fanatics back in the day. I mean, there's still some, but back in the days, like 10 years ago, when people would say, hey, you gotta try MacBook, it's so great. People are like that with Surfaces now, and I can see what they mean. Like, these are great products. But again, this design just brings some fundamental compromises, and I'm really not pleased with them advertising this to be a professional laptop with this CPU. That gets me to the other compromise. So while this has great ports, it has the little, Microsoft version of MagSafe, has USB-C, it has 2 USB ports, and it has an SD card slot. That's a great mix of I/O, input, output. It's really great. But there's a problem. It's slow. So this USB-C, it's not Thunderbolt 3. So yeah, you have a 1060, but when that gets old, you can't use any external graphics cards. Not only that, though, if you're a pro audio engineer, or if you need RAID desktop external disk drives that use Thunderbolt, you can't use that, which is a big shame. The MacBook, by comparison, has 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. Granted, that's all it has, but Microsoft, you could have put at least 1 in here. Also, these USB ports, this is really technical, but they are 3.1 Gen 1, not Gen 2, meaning they're not the fastest USB ports you can get. So if you plug in even like a normal, like a Samsung T5, like an external SSD, it's not going to be very fast. It's limiting, and it won't even charge your devices that quickly if you charge your phone from it. So I think there's a reason that's the case, and again, it's the CPU. It's what Microsoft is using. There's only a limited amount of communication and lanes that can pass between the CPU, which is in this part of the laptop, and the bottom, because it has to communicate through the hinge. So it's basically an engineering challenge, and I get that. I feel it from Microsoft. But I think this speaks to a design strategy that Microsoft is following that doesn't work. Basically, I think Microsoft needs to ditch Intel. First of all, AMD is more competitive than they've ever been. ARM chips are looking pretty capable. As Qualcomm makes really capable ones, Apple's iPads are faster than this, significantly faster if you count CPU performance, and in graphics they're catching up. And those are fanless. This thing actually does have some fans, and you'll hear them occasionally. So I really think the CPU might be the worst part of this laptop. And it hampers a lot of other elements. The CPU is a really fundamental part of a laptop. It's the I/O, it's how it performs, and on this Surface, it's just slow. And even the disk speeds. It uses pretty fast SSDs, they're NVMe, they're not quite as fast as a MacBook. I mean, that's not as big of a deal, but it's unfortunate to see Microsoft cheaping out in those ways. It just is not what you want to see in a laptop at this price. Where does that put us in the long term? Well, I still think the Surface Book 2 is an excellent laptop. And if you can find a good price on one used, well, maybe pick it up if you want a laptop and you can see yourself, using it as a tablet for reading Kindle books or watching YouTube videos or taking notes. That's useful. And the ideal solution would be to have something like a Dell XPS or a MacBook or a gaming laptop that's really beefy, and an iPad to be a portable tablet, right? But if you add the price of those things, well, then that's even more expensive than this. So I can see the utility of having a neat all-in-one computer, because it is kind of an all-in-one. But like I mentioned before, that kind of means that it's not great at being portable because of the weird hinge design, and it's not particularly great at being professional because of the CPU design that they need for this. As a result, well, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this. To be honest, I am a lot more excited to see the direction the iPad is going in, or even the Surface Pro tablets, which are, just cheaper and smaller and better at what they do, than where this is going. Because while this is a really cool machine and I appreciate having it, it's also been limiting in frustrating ways, and it has these weird compromises that, just inherent to the design of it. So for today's world, the Surface Book 2, like I said, is a great laptop. But for the world of tomorrow, I just don't see where this fits in.